Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the most inbred women in US history, locked for generations in a sealed barn that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. On the 17th of October, 1997, a call came into the sheriff's office in Lane County, Oregon. It was not a cry for help, nor was it an accusation. It was something far more unsettling, a whisper from the edge of society. A voice steeped in a quiet, neighborly dread that had finally boiled over. The man on the line refused to give his name, his anonymity a shield against the darkness he was about to expose. His words, preserved on the cold, magnetic hum of an archive tape, painted a picture of profound wrongness. He spoke of the old Blackwood property, a sprawling, isolated farmstead some 40 kilometers from the center of Oak Ridge, and of the large, faded red barn that stood upon it, silent and monolithic. "There is something wrong in that barn," the voice insisted, strained with a fear that had been building for years. "I have never seen anyone come in or out, but at night, sometimes I hear shouts. They are not animals." When Sheriff Thomas Wilkins and his deputies arrived, the scene was one of aggressive, almost defiant, neglect. The property was choked by a dense curtain of vegetation, a wild and untamed barrier that seemed designed to repel not just people, but reality itself. A barbed wire fence, nearly 3 meters high, sagged between weathered posts, its rusted barbs like thorns on a dying rose. And there, at the heart of it all, stood the barn. From a distance, it was an unremarkable relic of rural America. Up close, it was a fortress. The single large door was a web of heavy chains, multiple locks, and thick, rusted padlocks that had not been turned in years. It was not a structure meant to keep things out. It was designed, with a chilling, methodical intentionality, to keep something in. The moment the officers breached the door with bolt cutters and a battering ram, the air itself seemed to recoil. The odor that rushed out to meet them was the first wave of the horror. A physical assault on the senses. It was a vile concoction of stale urine, feces, the metallic tang of old blood, and something else. Something indefinably putrid that one deputy would later struggle to describe as the smell of the very absence of humanity. As their eyes adjusted to the gloom, pierced only by thin slivers of light from cracks in the roof, the source of the soundless screams became visible. 7 figures, 7 women, were huddled in the shadows, their forms barely distinguishable from the filth. Their ages, the investigators would later determine, ranged from a tender 12 to a weathered 42. They were living in conditions that the official police report, in its sterile, objective language, would classify as incompatible with any standard of human dignity. Dr. Michael Stevenson, the county coroner who accompanied the raid, a man who had spent 27 years looking into the face of death, was visibly shaken. His words to the Portland Herald would echo across the nation. "In all my years of medicine," he stated, his voice heavy with disbelief, "I have never seen anything like that." The women's physical forms were a testament to a long-held, terrible secret. They bore the unmistakable marks of severe and prolonged consanguinity, twisted spines, facial malformations, extra digits on their hands, and obvious visual impairments. Their hair was matted, their clothes little more than crudely stitched rags. But it was their eyes that truly haunted the first responders. Every single one of them, from the youngest girl to the oldest woman, possessed the exact same vacant, hollow look, a profound emptiness that spoke of a life lived not just in shadow, but without a soul. They did not react to the intrusion of the police. They did not cry out. They did not recoil. They simply stared. Their shared gaze a window into a void, as if the concept of rescue was as alien to them as the sunlight. The truth, which would unravel in the coming weeks, was more monstrous than anyone could have conceived. This barn was not merely a prison. It was a laboratory. It was the epicenter of a generational experiment in human endogamy, a deliberate project of genetic isolation that had been running, in secret and in darkness, for at least 5 generations. To understand the horror discovered on that October night, one must look not to the events of a single day, but to the poisoned soil upon which the barn was built, and to the dark history that had seeped into the very foundations of a family. The Blackwood property was a place with a past, a 200-acre tract of mountainous land that had always been on the fringe of the Oak Ridge community. The dense Oregon forests and rolling hills that surrounded it created a natural amphitheater of isolation. Its reputation was sealed long before the Blackwoods arrived, according to the Lane County Historical Archives. The land was sold for a pittance in 1931 because no one else wanted it. 7 years prior, in 1924, its former owner, a farmer named John Wickman, had descended into a quiet madness and murdered his entire family before taking his own life. The land, local folklore whispered, was stained by the tragedy, and so it sat empty, a monument to a private sorrow, until a man as desperate and isolated as the property itself came along. That man was Elijah Blackwood, Jeremiah's grandfather, a former miner who had lost everything in the economic collapse of the Great Depression. Elijah purchased the 200-acre property for a mere $175. He arrived with his wife, Martha, and their 5 children, seeking not a community, but a refuge from a world he no longer trusted, a world that had betrayed him. The family's isolation was immediate and absolute. School records from the Oak Ridge Municipal Library show that the Blackwood children attended the local school for just a single year before being withdrawn for home education. A note from the school director, dated 1933, offers a chilling glimpse into the family's nature. Family demonstrates extreme behavior, not integrated. Children exhibit proper knowledge for age, but avoid contact with other students. This was not just shyness. It was a taught, ingrained suspicion of outsiders. This avoidance hardened into a rigid, paranoid doctrine. The family's trips to town became rare, ritualistic affairs. A diary kept by the local warehouse owner between 1935 and 1940, now preserved at the Oak Ridge Historical Museum, records these visits with a sense of unease. The Blackwoods came today. One entry reads, "As always, the children and Mrs. B stayed in the car while the old man made the shopping. He never buys sweets or toys. Only staples. No one smiles in that family. Bought unusual amounts of kerosene and ammunition. Something doesn't seem right with them." This self-imposed exile was fiercely defended. When recruitment agents for World War II visited the property in 1943, police records state that Elijah met them with a shotgun, declaring that no Blackwood would spill blood for a government that only remembers men when it needs them to die. For reasons not fully clarified in the archives, the authorities chose not to press the matter. The Blackwoods were left alone. A small, sovereign nation of paranoia, walled off from the rest of the world, stewing in a broth of resentment and fear. This legacy of paranoia and seclusion did not die with Elijah. It was a birthright, a poisoned chalice passed down to his son. Harold, a man who would take his father's isolation and add a new, terrible ingredient to the family's dark legacy, a secret bride. In 1952, Harold Blackwood married his own second cousin, a woman named Rebecca who lived in Idaho. The wedding was officially registered in Boise, but Rebecca was never truly seen by the community of Oak Ridge. Elena Wilson, a former local male employee who was 93 at the time of the 1997 investigation, recalled the strange arrival in her testimony. Harold just appeared one day with a wife, she said. We never really saw her, right? She was always in the car, always wearing a wide flap hat and a veil, even in the summer. I delivered letters to her for a while from Idaho, then, after a couple of years, they just stopped. She had, for all intents and purposes, been swallowed by the Blackwood farm, her existence erased from the world beyond its barbed wire borders, behind the property's veil of secrecy. A grim biological reality was unfolding. Medical records, crudely kept on the property in a leather-bound ledger, indicate that between 1953 and 1962, Rebecca gave birth to 6 children, all of them delivered at home without any professional medical assistance. Of these 6 infants, only 3 survived past childhood. Jeremiah, born in 1956, and his siblings Mary and Joseph, the other 3 babies, according to Harold's own notes in the ledger, died of congenital complications. These quiet, unrecorded deaths were the first tangible, tragic signs of the genetic decay that was taking root within the family's shallow gene pool. The first sacrifices on the altar of their purity for any other family. This pattern of loss would have been a devastating tragedy, a cause for seeking help, for questioning their isolation. For Harold Blackwood, steeped in a lifetime of paranoia and the doctrine of his father, it was something else entirely. It was a sign in the fragility of his own offspring. He did not see a flaw in their bloodline. He saw a flaw in the world that had made them weak. It was in this crucible of grief and delusion that a terrible idea began to form the belief that the Blackwood blood was not cursed, but that it was pure, and that its purity needed to be protected, concentrated, and strengthened at any cost. That terrible idea found its voice in a disturbing entry in Harold's ledger. Dated 1962, penned in a shaky but determined hand. The words marked the point of no return, the moment a vague family philosophy curdled into a concrete, monstrous ideology. Rebecca is too weak for more children, he wrote, the ink bleeding slightly into the cheap paper. But we don't need strangers. We have our own pure blood, strong like steel when kept without mixtures. The weak die so that the strong prosper. This is the law of nature that the men of the city forgot. This was the inciting conflict, not a gunshot, but the scratch of a pen on paper, a declaration of war against the natural order. This doctrine would become the central text of his son Jeremiah's life. When Harold died in 1978, the victim of a gruesome accident with his tractor found pinned beneath the machine. His body mangled 22-year-old Jeremiah took control of the property and the family with an unnerving calm. There was no formal investigation in such an isolated place. A farming accident was just that. Jeremiah oversaw the simple burial himself, in a corner of the property marked by an unadorned wooden cross. His face a mask of stoicism that bordered on indifference. He inherited not just the land, but the ideology, and he would pursue it with a fanaticism that his father had only hinted at. He saw his father's death not as a tragedy, but as a mantle being passed, a bloody coronation that confirmed his own destiny as the true shepherd of the Blackwood line. Under Jeremiah's leadership, the family's isolation intensified from a passive state to an active, aggressive policy. His first act as patriarch was to solidify his control over his younger siblings, Mary and Joseph, who were now completely severed from any reality but his. In the days following their father's death, he gathered them in the dim light of the main house's kitchen. He didn't offer comfort, he offered purpose. He spoke of their father not as a victim of an accident, but as a martyr to their cause, a man who had protected their purity until his last breath. He twisted their shared grief into a shared, secret purpose, convincing them that their father's death was a test of their strength, a sign that they must turn inward completely to survive the coming collapse of the outside world. A collapse he described with feverish certainty. While his father had maintained minimal contact for essential purchases, Jeremiah sought to sever the final thread connecting them to the world. The last recorded transaction by any member of the Blackwood family occurred in 1983. Records from an agricultural supply store show that Jeremiah acquired vast quantities of seeds, farming tools, and construction materials enough to sustain a small, self-sufficient colony for a very long time. It was a final, calculated transaction, the act of a man pulling up the drawbridge to his kingdom. The store owner would later recall the young man's unnerving intensity, his refusal to make eye contact, and the way he paid in cash with old, musty bills that smelled of damp earth and disuse. From that point on, the Blackwood farm went dark, vanishing from the consciousness of the outside world, a ghost on the edge of town. Inside this self-imposed exile, the pressure began to build. Jeremiah, who had developed a self-taught and dangerously skewed interest in genetics from old books found on the property early 20th century eugenics texts, manuals on animal husbandry, and decontextualized religious tracts began to transition from simple isolation to a deliberate, documented project of what he called genetic purification. He spent his nights by kerosene lamp, poring over the texts, underlining passages with a thick, dark pencil, his mind a fertile ground for their poisonous ideas. He became obsessed with the concept of recessive genes, viewing them as hidden impurities that needed to be bred out through controlled, successive generations. The pressure was no longer just external, a defense against the world. It became internal, a force exerted upon his own family. His diaries, seized in 1997, revealed the terrifying evolution of his thinking. The outside world corrupts the blood, he wrote in an entry from 1985. Each generation that remains pure strengthens what we are. The weak will die, the strong will prosper. In 5 generations, we will have created something that the world has never seen. He began to meticulously chart his family's traits, noting eye color, bone structure, and perceived weaknesses with a chilling detachment, referring to his siblings not by name, but as Specimen M and Specimen J. He was no longer just a farmer in his own mind. He had become a creator, a god shaping his own lineage. This escalating ambition required a new stage, a new laboratory. The Red Barn, which had been built in 1980, was now repurposed, with Joseph as his silent, compliant assistant. Jeremiah began the grim work of transformation. The sounds of hammers echoed across the property as they boarded up windows, reinforced walls, and installed the heavy bolts. For Mary, this work was a source of constant, low-level dread. She watched structure change, its purpose shifting from sheltering animals to caging something else, and a cold fear settled in her heart. She once questioned Jeremiah, asking what the extra locks were for. His response was cold and final: for protection, to keep the pure in and the rot out. For Joseph, younger and fully under his brother's sway, it was a sacred duty, a necessary fortification against the decaying world. The pressure of Jeremiah's ideology was now being given physical form, in timber and nails and, Most importantly, in locks. The barn was no longer a symbol of rural life. It was becoming a symbol of absolute control, a place where his theories on blood purity would be put into horrific practice. The stage was set for a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, hidden from the world by a thicket of trees and a doctrine of fear. The full, horrifying scope of Jeremiah's plan exploded into reality through the discovery of his own hand-drawn blueprints, found tucked away in a locked desk drawer in the main house. The brittle pages were detailed and meticulously labeled, depicting the Red Barn not as a single open space, but as a two-story prison. The ground floor featured a common area with a long wooden table and a wood stove, but the second floor had been partitioned into small cell-like cubicles, each just large enough for a straw mattress. In the margins, Jeremiah had scrawled cold, clinical notes on sunlight exposure, ventilation, and nutrient requirements, as if he were designing a facility for livestock, not for human beings. He had even sketched out a rudimentary system for waste disposal, involving buckets and a pulley system, a detail that underscored the long-term, permanent nature of his vision. Most disturbingly, the plans showed an elaborate system of locks and bolts on the doors, all of which could only be operated from the outside. This was the midpoint climax of the investigation, the irrefutable, premeditated proof that the barn was designed for human captivity, life inside this structure. As pieced together by investigators from the physical evidence and later testimonies, was a medieval nightmare dropped into the 20th century. There was no electricity, no proper plumbing. Water was collected from rain in barrels, often teeming with insects and tasting of moss and decay. The windows had been boarded over, plunging the interior into a perpetual twilight that, according to psychologists, was a calculated form of temporal disorientation, erasing the boundaries between day and night, week and month. The only sounds were the creaking of the old wood, the whisper of the wind through the cracks, and the soft, desperate noises of its inhabitants. And then, from this darkness, a voice finally emerged. It was the voice of Sarah, the oldest of the rescued women, then 42 years old. After days of patient work by a female investigator, in a quiet, sterile room far from the farm, Sarah began to speak. In a recorded statement, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, she delivered the final devastating revelation that confirmed the investigators' worst fears. She was Jeremiah's biological daughter, and her mother was Mary, Jeremiah's own sister. Sarah had been the first to be confined to the barn, locked away at the age of 15, the inaugural subject of the experiment. "Daddy said we were special," she recounted, her words preserved forever in the FBI's archives. "That our blood was purer than that of any family in America. He had books on how horse breeders maintain pure strains. He said we were doing the same thing, only better." The great and terrible secret had finally been given a voice, and its testimony would prove more damning than any physical evidence could ever be. Sarah's testimony was the key that turned the lock on the Blackwood family's darkest secrets. Her words, spoken in a monotone that belied their horrific content, provided investigators with a chilling roadmap. They now returned to the main house, not as officers searching for clues, but as archaeologists of a private hell, knowing precisely what they were looking for. The irrefutable evidence they sought was not hidden in plain sight. It was curated, organized, and preserved with a terrifying pride. In a locked office that Jeremiah had kept as his private sanctum, a room that smelled of old paper, dust, and an unnerving, sterile orderliness, they found dozens of notebooks, their pages filled with this cramped, meticulous handwriting. These were not the ramblings of a madman. They were the clinical records of a monster. Each of the 7 women had a section, a chip, as Jeremiah called it, detailing not just her lineage, but her physical characteristics, her history of pregnancies, and, most disturbingly, her reproductive value. A cold calculation ranked on a scale of 1 to 10. One anonymized entry read, Subject 5, rose line, hair dark, eyes, heterochromia, desirable trait, bone structure delicate, reproductive value 6 to 10. Notes, prone to respiratory weakness, requires monitoring. Diet to be supplemented with iron-rich herbs to strengthen blood for breeding. Another entry for a younger girl noted, Subject 7, April line, strong constitution, high pain tolerance observed, potential for high reproductive value, 8-10. Begin observation for puberty onset. The entries were devoid of empathy, reading more like an agricultural ledger than a family record. He noted the surprisingly nutritious, though monotonous, diet provided to the women, vegetables from the property, eggs, and milk. A report by nutritionist Elizabeth Dawson would later confirm this, stating, this was not a typical case of nutritional deprivation. On the contrary, there was an almost obsessive concern with certain nutrients. Jeremiah's notebooks explained why he had formulated homemade supplements from herbs, a twisted form of care designed not for their well-being, but for their utility as breeding stock. Perhaps the most heartbreaking piece of evidence was discovered not in Jeremiah's meticulous records, but hidden beneath the thin straw mattress of Emma, the second oldest woman. It was a collection of notebooks filled with detailed drawings, a secret atlas of an imagined world based only on the faded images in the few practical manuals allowed in the barn and the fragmented stories told by the older women. Emma had sketched cities that resembled 19th century illustrations, with horses and carriages sharing the streets with strange, box-like automobiles. She drew fantastical animals, creatures born from verbal descriptions of cats and dogs she had never seen. One recurring image was of a family sitting around a dinner table, all of them smiling, their faces turned toward a warm, yellow sun drawn in the corner of the page, a scene of simple domestic joy she could only conjure in her mind. Her art was a silent, powerful testament to the profound informational and temporal isolation in which they had been kept, a world frozen in a time that had never existed. It was irrefutable proof of a stolen reality. Alongside these drawings, investigators found another item, a heavily altered Bible, from which Jeremiah had physically torn out passages concerning forgiveness and mercy, while underlining verses about purity, separation, and divine judgment with a thick, red pencil. The full horrifying truth, however, was not fully unveiled until investigators pieced together Sarah's testimony with the chilling philosophy laid bare in Jeremiah's own journals. Here, in these private pages, was his confession not of a crime, but of a grand, divine purpose. He saw himself not as an abuser, but as a visionary, a purifier. The first generations would suffer so that the future can transcend, he wrote in an entry dated 1992. The ancient Egyptians understood this. The pharaohs married their sisters for divine reasons, not worldly ones. The weak are naturally eliminated. The strong survive and strengthen themselves. In another 10 generations, we will have created a superior lineage. This was not ignorance. It was a toxic combination of isolation, pathological narcissism, and a distorted interpretation of eugenics and population genetics. Subjects he studied from books occasionally ordered through the mail. When confronted with these journals during his interrogation, Jeremiah showed no remorse. Instead, he attempted to lecture the stunned investigators, explaining his theories with a condescending patience, utterly convinced of his own genius and their intellectual inferiority. The system he created was methodical, according to Sarah's testimony and Jeremiah's own logs. As soon as the girls in the barn reached puberty, they were entered into the breeding program. Jeremiah or his brother, Joseph, would visit them in a documented rotation. The resulting pregnancies were frequent, though many ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Weak babies did not survive, explained Dr. Robert Peterson, the forensic psychiatrist assigned to the case. And this was considered natural, even desirable, within their belief system. The male children who survived were eventually taken to the main house to be raised and indoctrinated by Jeremiah. Taught to read only from the altered Bible and the eugenics texts, they were being groomed as the next generation of guardians for the project. The girls, however, remained in the barn with their mothers, perpetuating the cycle of imprisonment and abuse. To maintain control, Jeremiah had constructed an elaborate apocalyptic mythology. He filtered real-world news he occasionally heard on a battery-powered radio, the Chernobyl disaster, the AIDS epidemic, and twisted them into signs of the imminent collapse of civilization. Daddy said that the outside world was full of radiation, that people were sick and deformed. One of the younger women, Lily, would later recount in a therapy session. He said we were the only healthy people left, and that one day, when it was safe, we would leave and repopulate the earth. Joseph Blackwood's confession, given in a series of halting interviews, painted a different, though no less tragic, picture. While Jeremiah was the architect of the horror, Joseph was its reluctant, broken enforcer. He described a childhood ruled by his brother's iron will, a world where Jeremiah's word was law and scripture. He recounted one instance where he had tried to sneak a piece of candy to one of the younger girls, an act of simple kindness. Jeremiah had found out and punished him not with violence, but with a week of complete silence and shunning, a psychological torment that had broken his will to ever disobey again. I grew up believing the world was as Jeremiah said. He wrote in a letter to the court before his sentencing. I never knew another reality. This does not justify what I did, but perhaps it explains how a human being can become an accomplice to something so horrible without fully recognizing its horror. His confession was not a proud declaration like his brother's, but the sorrowful admission of a man slowly awakening to the nightmare he had helped create. The legal and societal repercussions were swift and seismic. Jeremiah and Joseph Blackwood were arrested on the day of the discovery. Their psychiatric evaluations deemed them both fit to stand trial. In September 1998, after a 3-week trial that captivated and horrified the nation, the verdict was delivered. The courtroom was a media circus, but inside, a somber gravity held sway, particularly when Sarah's testimony was played on a large screen. Her face calm, her eyes telling a story of unimaginable suffering. A hush fell over the gallery as a disembodied voice filled the room, a ghost from a living grave. Jeremiah, who remained impassive and defiant throughout the proceedings, refusing to recognize the court's authority, was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for a litany of charges including kidnapping, rape, incest, and child abuse. Joseph, for whom the prosecutors argued had acted under the psychological coercion of his brother, received a sentence of 45 years. During the sentencing, Judge Ellen Hayes delivered a statement that resonated across the country. This is not just a case of extreme abuse, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of sorrow and steel. It is a case of the deliberate and systematic perversion of the fundamental principles of humanity, extending for decades and affecting multiple generations. The court rarely finds circumstances where the social reintegration of a defendant is considered fundamentally impossible. But this is one of those cases. Jeremiah's only statement came at the very end, as he was led away. He looked not at the judge, but at the cameras, his eyes burning with a cold fire. You do not understand what you have destroyed, he said, his voice clear and steady. It was not a prison. It was a sanctuary. It was not cruelty. It was directed evolution. In 100 years, when your lineages are weak and sick, the world will regret what was lost here. His words hung in the air, a final, unrepentant testament to his monstrous delusion and a chilling postscript to a story of unimaginable darkness. For the 7 women of the Blackwood barn, the slam of the prison door for their captors was not an end to their ordeal, but the beginning of a new, bewildering one. The morning of October 21st, 1997, marked their first full day of a life they had never been prepared for. After preliminary medical evaluations that documented a shocking array of physical ailments, severe malnutrition despite the nutrient-focused diet, advanced dental decay, skeletal deformities, and compromised immune systems, they were transferred to a specialized facility in Portland, where a multidisciplinary team of doctors, psychologists, social workers, and special educators began what would become one of the most complex rehabilitation processes ever documented in the United States. The world that was a birthright to others was, to them, a terrifying and alien landscape. The constant noise of the city was a physical assault, causing panic attacks and sensory overload. The flicker of a television screen was an incomprehensible, frightening magic. Basic concepts like electricity, currency, or even the idea of a world beyond the Oregon mountains were abstract theories they struggled to grasp. One of the younger women, April, screamed in terror the first time she saw her own reflection in a mirror. Having never truly seen her own face before, the simple act of choosing a meal from a menu was paralyzing, as the concept of personal preference had never been allowed to form. This daunting challenge led to the creation of what would later be known as the Blackwood Protocol, a model for rescuing victims of extreme, prolonged isolation. "We couldn't simply launch them into the modern world," explained Dr. Catherine Morris, the program's coordinator. In a later interview, everything was completely alien to them. "We had to create a transition environment, a sort of halfway world, where they could be gradually exposed to aspects of modern life, always with intensive psychological support." This halfway world was a specially designed wing of the facility, with muted lighting, soundproofed walls, and rooms that gradually introduced modern amenities. They started with hand-cranked lamps before moving to electric ones, and meals were initially served communally and without choice, slowly transitioning to individual selections. Their initial progress was measured in heartbreakingly small steps, learning to use a fork instead of their hands, understanding that a light switch would not harm them, or accepting that the food provided to them was not part of a system of control and reward. The psychological scars were the deepest. The women suffered from a severe form of institutionalization, their identities so intertwined that they initially struggled to function as individuals, often referring to themselves as "we" instead of "I." They had developed their own dialect, a mixture of archaic English and unique words to describe their confined world. The sun was the watcher, and rain was sky tears. Therapists had to first learn their language before they could even begin to help them unlearn their trauma. Neuropsychological tests revealed varying degrees of intellectual disability in 5 of the 7 women. A tragic cocktail of genetic factors and extreme sensory and educational deprivation. Yet, within this landscape of damage, there were astonishing pockets of resilience. Sarah, despite her circumstances, demonstrated an above-average cognitive capacity. She had taught herself to read from the few books in the barn and, in turn, had taught the others, creating a secret school in the heart of their prison. She had even developed a complex system of counting time based on the shifting patterns of light that filtered through the cracks in the roof, a testament to a mind that refused to be extinguished. The impact of the Blackwood case extended far beyond the lives of the individuals involved, sending ripples through the legal, social, and scientific communities. In 2003, spurred by Sarah's quiet but powerful advocacy and the glaring gaps in oversight that the case had exposed, the United States Congress approved the Sarah Law. The legislation faced initial opposition, primarily from homeschooling groups concerned about government overreach. But the sheer horror of the Blackwood case provided an undeniable impetus for change. This landmark legislation established new protocols for monitoring the welfare of children in home education settings, particularly in isolated rural areas, requiring periodic wellness checks by social services. It created special funds for training social workers and law enforcement in these communities to identify the subtle signs of extreme family abuse and isolation. The law was a formal acknowledgement that the privacy of a family ends where the safety of a child begins. In the scientific community, the anonymized medical data collected from the Blackwood women, always with their full and informed consent, became an invaluable, albeit tragic, resource. A longitudinal study, which is still in progress at the University of Washington, has generated dozens of scientific publications, significantly contributing to the understanding of the effects of severe, multi-generational consanguinity on human health. These studies have helped improve diagnostic tools and treatments for various rare genetic conditions, a legacy of healing born from a legacy of harm. In 2015, 18 years after the rescue, the Blackwood property, which had stood as a decaying monument to the horror it once concealed, was finally demolished by the state of Oregon. The event was not publicized, done quietly on a gray overcast morning. For the small community of Oak Ridge, it was a moment of collective, unspoken relief. The final removal of a cancer from their landscape, where the red barn once stood. A small memorial was established, not a grand statue, but a simple bronze plaque set in a field of wildflowers. Its words serve as a permanent, quiet warning to honor the resilience of the human spirit in the face of extreme cruelty, to remember that community vigilance must never be replaced by isolation. Of the 7 women rescued, 5 eventually managed to establish independent lives, though with varying degrees of need for continuous support. They learned to drive, to manage their own finances, and to navigate a world that once terrified them. One found joy in gardening, another in painting, channeling the creativity that Emma had shown in her hidden notebooks. They remained fiercely protective of one another, forming a new kind of family, one built on shared survival rather than imposed doctrine. Rose and April, the 2 most severely affected by their genetic conditions, remained under-specialized, lifelong care in a quiet, comfortable group home, finding peace in a simple, protected routine. And Sarah, the first victim and the voice that broke the silence, became a respected activist for the rights of abuse victims, a living symbol of survival. She never married, nor had children, choosing instead to dedicate her life to ensuring no one else would suffer as she had. The story of the Blackwood farm is a story of the deepest darkness imaginable, a chronicle of how isolation, paranoia, and a perverse ideology can create a private hell on earth. But it is also a testament to the extraordinary human capacity for recovery, adaptation, and resilience. In a speech at the National Conference on Child Abuse in 2010, Sarah offered a perspective that no one else could. "People often ask me how I survived those years in the barn," she said, her voice steady and clear before a silent, captivated audience. "The truth is, I survived because I never knew there was an alternative. Survival was all there was. Now, I know there was a whole world beyond those walls, a world of choice, of freedom, of simple kindness." Her mission, she explained, was to ensure that no other child ever grows up without knowing they are entitled to that world. Meanwhile, deep within the walls of a maximum security prison, Jeremiah Blackwood lives out his days in the same isolation he once imposed on others. Prison records indicate he has never shown a moment of remorse. He spends his time reading texts on history and genetics, refusing most human contact, still utterly convinced of his righteousness. Joseph, in a separate, low-security facility, has reportedly taken a different path, participating in therapy and expressing profound guilt. He will be eligible for parole in his late 60s, a prospect that brings a complex mix of fear and hope to the surviving women. The legacy of the Blackwood case, therefore, is a dual one. It is a dark reminder of the extremes to which humanity can sink when shielded by secrecy and isolation. But it is also a powerful testament to the light that can re-emerge. Even after generations of darkness, it leaves us with a profound and unsettling question. How many other dark corners of the world remain unlit, simply because no one has yet thought to look?